sent back to India to be a journalist. But he does, he throws himself into the job, he learns his thing, and he manages to break out. People forget this too, that he breaks out of the civil station, that little cordon sanitaire in which the British surrounded themselves, the civil station, the native town, the native city. And he goes on his night walks and he gradually learns to love India. People forget that. He talks about, I have connected with the dark and crooked, the fantastic and wicked and awesome, inspiring life of the native. I love them. Sorry, no. So Ruddy does, yes, he writes about the foibles of Anglo society, but let's remember, he was a taboo breaker. He breaks the taboos of caste, in terms of the caste system that the British had over there. He breaks the taboo of sex because he writes about interracial love affairs, and above all, he writes about the common soldier. The first time ever, he writes about ordinary people, not just the common soldier, the common Indian peasant. He has a big love affair with Indian peasantry. There's a wonderful image of him. I remember seeing walking away, his parents see him walking with an Indian ploughman hand in hand, and they say, come on, Ruddy, time to go home. So, no, this is my brother, he says. To me, that symbolizes very nicely. We do not misunderstand the man and his relations with India. Yes, he hates Indian politicians because they undermine, everything that he stands for. But at the same time, he loves the common man. 1887, the Golden Jubilee. He's asked to write a poem. What does he write? This is what he writes. He's asked to write about the Queen Empress and celebrate the Queen Empress and empire. No, he says, this means nothing to Indians. By the well where the bullocks go, silent and blind and slow, by the field where the young corn dies in the face of the sultry skies, they have heard as the dull earth hears the voice of the wind of the hour, the voice of the great Queen's voice, the sound of the great Queen's voice. My God hath given me years, hath granted to me no power, and I bid you, O land, rejoice. But the Indian peasant is not in the least concerned about this. The ploughman settled the share more deep in the sun-dried clod. Mogul, Maratha, and Malay, by which he means foreigners. From the north and the white queen over the sea, God raiseth them up and driveth them forth, as the dust of the ploughshare flies in the breeze, but the wheat and the cattle are all in my care, and the rest is the will of God. He's not interested in them. And I want to stress that right about Ruddy. He has poetry running through his veins. I found that bit, sorry. So Ruddy is famous at 25, but he turns his back on the literary intelligence, he turns his back on literary London for the demotic verse as expressed in the music hall. It's his Soldiers' Three Stories, his barrack-room ballads. His voices touch the popular nerve, precisely because they give that populace a voice it has never had before. And Kipling's words are imprinted or are collected unconsciously extraordinary degree, far greater than we realise. And I'm really running out of time, aren't I? Compare and contrast again, Eric Blair. What does he do, 25? No ideas. He goes off and he joins the very sink of the imperial services, by which I mean the police. Filled with self-hating may have been, but he toes the line. And indeed, there's a horrid account of him beating up a Burmese student who actually bumps into him on Rangoon railway station. Blair at 25, absolute zilch. I'm going to be very mean about it, but I hope somebody's being mean about it. Not me. And later years, the rejection of society through self-degradation becomes a central theme of his life, it seems to me. I see it as a bogus rejection. Orwell always plays safe, it seems to me. He always stays on side. He presents himself as a man of the people. He remains at heart an elitist, filled with contempt for the common man. To me, Kipling is the voice of the common man.
Well, thank you for that. That's the robust case for Kipling, with a few underhand jibes at Orwell thrown in for good measure. Stuart.
Well, in terms of speaking for Orwell against Kipling, it's a bit difficult because we're a British audience and we always root for the underdog. So Kipling has an issue here, but the subject of underdog is very interesting, and actually Britishness is an interesting concept as well when we're talking about both Kipling and Orwell. And to me, Orwell sums up a certain kind of Britishness, if you like, a traditional Britishness, and does that in a very succinct and very interesting way, while retaining the contradictions which are inherent in British society. So the interesting point which is raised about Orwell being a person of the people, but yet also an elitist, is entirely true. And in that case, I think that his ideas of Britain and what it means to be British are perfectly encapsulated in both his fiction and his journalism. One of the things that I find interesting about Orwell is it's actually quite fashionable these days to say Orwell isn't actually a particularly good writer, which I find manifestly not to be the case. But there are essays and journals which will say that Orwell was a bit of a hack when it came to writing, particularly in fiction, not so much as journalism, certainly as fiction. But when you consider the opening line to 1984, his great masterpiece, which says, "It was a cold morning in April and the clocks were striking 13." Now, when you hear that read out, you know, it becomes such a cliche almost in terms of a bit of writing, but as an actual sentence, it is perfect. Because you have the image of the cold, crisp April morning, and that's in your head, that's got good associations within you, because April is Shakespeare's birthday, St George's Day. It is a classic English image of a wonderful spring day. And the clocks are striking 13. You already know that that means something incredibly upsetting with the association of 13. That is not a sentence that anyone would just ordinarily come up with if they're not a particularly good prose writer. And when you go through 1984, in particular, you can see images and ideas that are coming through that other writers simply wouldn't have even got close to. For all Isaac Asimov's thunderous criticism of 1984, there's an interesting essay. It's very long, rambling, inexact, and largely ill-thought-out rant against 1984. But he never came up, and could never come up with an image of the future being a boot smashing on the face forever. And in terms of Kipling, I think of that image because when we talk about the future and the future of Kipling, I do see that as a boot stamping on his reputation forever. We exist now in a very modern world in which Kipling does not simply really resonate. If you were to teach Kipling in a school, people would probably complain. You teach Orwell, you would say, great, okay, you're talking about the evils of totalitarianism or imperialism in that respect. Now, that's not to denigrate Kipling. I think that's more of a societal change, but it's something to bear in mind. I'm not saying that Kipling is a worse writer because of a change in society, but it is something that we have to consider and understand. The question of relevance to a modern audience is not something to be dismayed and discarded and ignored. The relevance of Orwell will continue to be the fact that he talks about Britain and British culture in a way that very few people have ever managed to do before or since. I'm thinking particularly about the essays in defence of British food. Now, I don't know if anybody has actually read this essay. It's fantastic. You wouldn't have thought that he would be able to defend British food in 1944, I think, when he wrote it. But he can, against the French, and he's very dismissive about the French, again, with the elitism side of things, but also his defence of British food, talking about our preserves, suet, pies, puddings. You could write that on a wall in a kind of restaurant or New Opening gastropub and think, wow, that's a really good statement of intent. Jane Oliver would be proud of that. And that is a rectangle, but also, to talk about pubs, which I like to do, there's a really wonderful essay where Orwell describes his perfect pub, which is called the Moon Underwater. It's not a pub I've been to. The Moon Underwater I've been to was in Manchester. It's a horrible Wetherspoons. The pub that he describes is an English idyll, and almost like an alcoholic Eden, where you walk in and you see a dog by the fireplace. You see two kinds of cold cuts on the bar. There are 3 pumps. There are different ales. You can get mild and stout. This is the place that you want to be. And right at the very end, just as he's describing this wonderful place, this haven away from the crowds, he says that this place doesn't exist. And it's then that you realise what Orwell is trying to do in so many ways is playing on the nostalgic nature of British culture, looking back to a time that may or may not have ever existed. Kipling's legacy is the fact that what he's talking about did exist. whereas Orwell is talking about a kind of Britishness that we all hope and realise that we all actually are. You know, the concepts was trotted out by any politician, the British concepts of fair play, and you know, everybody mucking in to help each other, whether it's split spirit or whatever it might be. But what's interesting is that Orwell encapsulates all the other things about making us British. The underdog, as I've mentioned, cynicism, pessimism, the fact that the weather is our first topic of conversation. What he manages to do very succinctly and in a political manner as well is he takes our daily lives and elevates it to a slightly different level. So the kinds of things that we talk about every day are not just the humdrum or the quotidian. These are the things which make us who we are. And while the short stories of Kipling are among some of the great successes and great triumphs, and as a writer of short stories myself, these are things to be aspired to. These are great bits of writing. Aspiring to Orwell with his understanding of what it feels like to be Gordon Comstock working in a bookshop, looking out the door and seeing all these well-dressed people walking down the street, and you sitting there looking at your mouldering remaining copy of your book, looking back at you and saying you are a failure. Your dreams have not come true. The people who walk past, they have. And his understanding of those small dreams being left unfulfilled, and this goes through all of his work, even in 1984, where a big dream has come crashing to the floor. And what's interesting about 1984 is it remains relevant as a critique of communism that we all know. You would have thought that once the year 1984 rolls around, Orwell's power would lose, Orwell's book's power would lose year on year its power. But if anything, it gains in power. And in fact, as Anthony Burgess points out in his book 1985, which consists of a critique of 1984, albeit one that I don't agree with, and then his sequel to 1984. If you take his idea that 1984 was originally to be called 1948, you realise what the book was trying to achieve and trying to look at. Kipling describes something that actually happened, whereas Orwell was looking at things that never actually quite happened. And that, to me, makes him the greater of the writers in terms of imagination and in terms of reflecting society by showing its fictional aspirations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stuart. I'm glad we came back to Gordon Comstock as well. Jen.
Thank you for that. Well, I'm a bit like Tony. I don't really want to choose between Orwell and Kipling. As a writer, Kipling I've loved since I was a child, Orwell I've loved since I was an adolescent. And Orwell's essay on Kipling, indeed, is one that I'm including in I'm editing a collection of essays on Kipling, including Charles has kindly contributed one. But Orwell's essay comes in, I think, as chapter 2, because I think it is such a classic. I think on Kipling's politics, Orwell was basically right. Tony has asked how I got interested in Kipling. Two ways, really. One is that I have loved Kipling's language ever since I first heard the Just So stories about the whale, the crab and the dab, and the skates and his mate and the pickery of Macquarie or Pickery. That's one thing. And the other is that for a very long time I've been interested in the relation between politics and literature. Gender politics, yes, but also class politics and imperial politics, and that is where Kipling comes in. Now, as I say, I admire Orwell's essay about Kipling. It's one of those essays that is accumulating even when it's wrong. My case for Kipling, really, is that Orwell massively underestimates him. He sees Kipling as somebody who identifies with authority. Charles has said, no, not a bit of it, Kipling identified with the underdog. Frankly, I think Kipling identified with both and never resolved it. Yes, he was on the side of authority, and this was true of the young Buddy. His letters, his early letters, which are sort of fascinatingly responsive to India, also show that he's that he very much identifies with this sort